The Second World War ended in 1945. The world rejoiced as the long and devastating conflict finally came to an end. Cities across the globe erupted in celebrations, and there was a collective sigh of relief. The Axis powers had been defeated, and the future seemed bright. Victory was declared against the Axis powers. Soldiers returned home, and nations began the arduous task of rebuilding. However, beneath the surface of this newfound peace, tensions were beginning to rise. However, a new conflict was brewing. The geopolitical landscape was shifting, and former allies were becoming wary of each other. The seeds of distrust were being sown, and the world was on the brink of a new kind of war. This conflict was the Cold War. Unlike the hot wars of the past, this was a war of ideologies, a battle for global influence and power. It was a clash between the United States and the Soviet Union. These two superpowers, once allies against a common enemy, now found themselves on opposite sides of a deep ideological divide. Unlike previous wars, this one involved no direct military confrontation between the superpowers. Instead, it was characterized by proxy wars, espionage, and a relentless arms race. The Cold War was a global standoff. Nations around the world were drawn into the orbit of either the United States or the Soviet Union, and the tension was palpable. It lasted for almost half a century. From the late 1940s to the early 1990s, the world was gripped by the fear of a potential nuclear apocalypse. This period was marked by intense rivalry. There was political maneuvering, espionage, and a constant jockeying for position on the global stage. Leaders from both sides engaged in a high-stakes game of chess, each move calculated to gain an advantage. There was also a constant threat of nuclear war. The development and stockpiling of nuclear weapons created a precarious balance of terror, known as mutually assured destruction. The entire world watched and waited, fearful of the consequences. The anxiety was pervasive as people lived under the shadow of potential annihilation. The roots of the Cold War lay in the closing days of World War II. As the war drew to a close, the alliance between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union began to unravel. The alliance between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union had begun to fray. At conferences like Yalta and Potsdam, it became clear that there were deep-seated disagreements about the post-war order. There were fundamental disagreements about the future of Europe. The division of Germany, and particularly Berlin, became a flashpoint for these tensions. The United States, with its capitalist democracy, and the Soviet Union, a communist dictatorship, had vastly different visions for the world. These competing ideologies were irreconcilable, and each side sought to expand its influence. These differences would define the decades to come. The Cold War shaped international relations, domestic policies, and the lives of millions. It was a period of uncertainty, fear, and profound change, the effects of which are still felt today. At the heart of the Cold War was a fundamental clash of ideologies. The United States championed democracy and capitalism. It advocated for free markets. It promoted individual liberties. The Soviet Union, in contrast, promoted communism. It sought to spread its ideology of a centrally controlled economy. It advocated for a one-party state. The United States viewed the Soviet Union as a dangerous and expansionist power. It feared the spread of communism into Western Europe and beyond. The Soviets, for their part, resented what they saw as American imperialism. They pointed to the United States' history of interventionism in Latin America and elsewhere. This ideological divide ran deep. It shaped every aspect of the Cold War. It fueled the arms race. It led to proxy wars. It even influenced cultural and sporting events. The world became a chessboard, with each superpower making strategic moves to counter the other. In the aftermath of World War II, Europe lay in ruins. Cities were devastated. Economies were shattered. The war had left a trail of destruction that seemed almost insurmountable. Infrastructure was in tatters, homes were reduced to rubble, and millions of people were displaced, struggling to find food and shelter. The continent faced a humanitarian crisis of unprecedented scale. The United States, fearing the spread of communism into this power vacuum, launched the Marshall Plan in 1948. Named after Secretary of State George Marshall, this initiative aimed to provide extensive economic aid to help rebuild European economies. The plan was not just about financial assistance, it was a strategic move to stabilize the region and prevent the rise of extremist ideologies. This massive economic aid package helped rebuild war-torn Western European nations. Billions of dollars were funneled into the reconstruction of infrastructure, industry and agriculture. Roads, bridges and factories were rebuilt, and the agricultural sector received much-needed support to ensure food security. The Marshall Plan was instrumental in revitalizing the economies of countries like France, West Germany and Italy. It fostered economic recovery and strengthened ties with the United States. American goods and technology flowed into Europe, boosting productivity and innovation. This period saw significant economic growth and prosperity in Western Europe, creating a stark contrast with the Eastern Bloc. The success of the Marshall Plan also solidified the political and economic alliance between the United States and Western Europe. The Soviet Union viewed the Marshall Plan with suspicion. To them, it was more than just an economic aid program. It was a strategic maneuver by the United States to extend its influence in Europe. The Soviets were wary of American intentions and saw the plan as a direct threat to their control over Eastern Europe. It saw it as a tool of American influence. Soviet propaganda painted the Marshall Plan as an imperialist plot designed to undermine socialism and spread capitalist ideology. Anti-American sentiment was fueled by posters and speeches warning Eastern European countries against accepting Western aid. In response, the Soviets tightened their grip on Eastern Europe. They increased their military presence and exerted greater control over the political and economic systems of these nations. The Soviet Union was determined to maintain its sphere of influence and prevent any Western encroachment. They installed communist governments in countries like Poland, Hungary and Czechoslovakia. These regimes were loyal to Moscow and followed the Soviet model of governance. The installation of these governments was often accompanied by purges and repression of political opposition, ensuring that Soviet control remained unchallenged. These countries became known as Soviet satellite states. They were essentially extensions of Soviet power, with their foreign and domestic policies closely aligned with those of the Kremlin. The term satellite state underscored the lack of true sovereignty and independence in these nations. They served as a buffer zone between the Soviet Union and the West. This buffer was crucial for Soviet security, providing a protective barrier against any potential Western aggression. The presence of Soviet troops and the establishment of pro-Soviet governments ensured that these countries would act as a first line of defense in the event of a conflict. The division of Europe was now firmly in place. The continent was split into two distinct spheres of influence, with the Western nations aligned with the United States and the Eastern Bloc under Soviet control. This division was not just political, but also ideological, with capitalism and democracy on one side and communism and authoritarianism on the other. The Iron Curtain, as Winston Churchill famously called it, had descended. This metaphor captured the stark separation between East and West, symbolizing the ideological and physical barriers that divided Europe. The Iron Curtain became a defining feature of the Cold War, representing the deep-seated mistrust and rivalry between the two superpowers. On one side stood the United States and its Western allies. These nations formed alliances such as NATO to counter the Soviet threat and ensure mutual defense. The Western Bloc emphasized economic cooperation, political stability, and collective security, creating a united front against the spread of communism. On the other side was the Soviet Union and its satellite states. In response to NATO, the Soviets established the Warsaw Pact, a military alliance of communist nations. This pact solidified the division of Europe and set the stage for decades of Cold War tensions and confrontations. This division would define the geopolitical landscape for decades. The Cold War era was marked by a constant state of tension, with both sides vying for global influence and dominance. the ideological battle between capitalism and communism played out in various forms, from proxy wars to space races, shaping the course of history in profound ways. Section 4. The Shadow of Armageddon, the Nuclear Arms Race. The development of the atomic bomb in 1945 ushered in a terrifying new era in human history. This monumental event was the result of the Manhattan Project, a secretive and ambitious endeavor that brought together some of the greatest scientific minds of the time. The successful detonation of the first atomic bomb, known as the Trinity Test, marked a pivotal moment that would forever change the course of global politics and warfare. The United States, initially the sole possessor of this devastating weapon, used it against Japan in the closing days of World War II. The bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki not only brought a swift end to the war, but also demonstrated the unparalleled destructive power of nuclear weapons. The images of the aftermath, with cities reduced to rubble and countless lives lost, served as a grim reminder of the potential for human annihilation. This act cast a long shadow over the nascent Cold War. The use of atomic bombs introduced a new level of fear and uncertainty into international relations. As the United States and the Soviet Union emerged as the two dominant superpowers, the world found itself divided into two opposing camps, each armed with the most destructive weapons ever created. The Soviet Union, determined to achieve parity with the United States, developed its own atomic bomb in 1949. This breakthrough was a significant achievement for Soviet scientists and marked the beginning of a fierce competition between the two superpowers. The successful test of the Soviet atomic bomb shattered the United States' monopoly on nuclear weapons and set the stage for an escalating arms race. This event marked the beginning of the nuclear arms race. Over the next several decades, both nations would engage in a relentless pursuit of nuclear superiority. The arms race was characterized by a series of technological advancements and an ever-increasing stockpile of nuclear weapons. Each side sought to outdo the other, leading to the development of more powerful and sophisticated bombs. Both superpowers poured massive resources into building larger and more powerful nuclear arsenals. The sheer scale of the arms buildup was staggering, with thousands of warheads being produced and deployed. Military parades showcased the might of these arsenals, serving as both a display of strength and a warning to potential adversaries. The world watched in horror as the doomsday clock ticked closer to midnight. The clock, a symbolic representation of the likelihood of a global catastrophe, became a powerful reminder of the ever-present threat of nuclear war. Civil defense drills and public awareness campaigns were conducted to prepare citizens for the possibility of a nuclear attack, further heightening the sense of fear and urgency. The nuclear arms race was driven by a chilling logic, mutually assured destruction, or MAD. This doctrine held that any nuclear attack by one superpower would result in a devastating retaliatory strike by the other, ensuring the total annihilation of both. The concept of MAD created a precarious balance where the threat of mutual destruction acted as a deterrent against the use of nuclear weapons. The theory behind MAD was that neither superpower would risk a nuclear attack if it meant facing a devastating retaliation. This led to the development of second strike capabilities, such as nuclear submarines and missile silos, which could survive an initial attack and launch a counterstrike. The strategic command centers of both nations were on constant alert, ready to respond to any perceived threat. This balance of terror, while preventing a nuclear holocaust, created an atmosphere of constant anxiety and fear. The threat of nuclear war loomed large over everyday life, influencing politics, culture, and society. Protests against nuclear weapons became common, and families built fallout shelters in their backyards, hoping to survive the unthinkable. The nuclear arms race, with its promise of mutual destruction, cast a long and ominous shadow over the latter half of the 20th century. Section 5. Living with the Bomb, Public Fear and Preparation. The threat of nuclear war had a profound impact on the lives of ordinary citizens. Governments on both sides of the Iron Curtain launched public awareness campaigns. These campaigns were designed to educate the public about the dangers of nuclear fallout. They also provided instructions on how to survive a nuclear attack. Bomb shelters were built in backyards and basements. Schools conducted duck and cover drills. People lived with the constant fear that the sirens might go off at any moment. This fear permeated popular culture, finding expression in books, films, and music. The Cold War was not just a geopolitical struggle. It was a psychological war that played out in the minds of millions. The constant threat of annihilation created a climate of anxiety and paranoia. It also fostered a sense of fatalism and resignation.